We're now going to continue our discussion of the four basic types of tissues, beginning with connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most abundant of the four basic types of tissues. It's found all over in the body, and it's also the most variable tissue in terms of its structure. And we will look at why exactly that is over the course of this lecture. As a group, connective tissues have a general structure of support and, to a lesser extent, protection. So they serve as frameworks, they provide support, they bind other types of tissue together, they fill spaces. But some of the specific types of connective tissues, because of their structure and the cells which make them up, also have other functions that aren't necessarily specifically related to support. Things like bone. Within the bone, you have marrow, which produces blood. You have adipose tissue, which has a fat storage, which serves as an energy reservoir. So we'll look at the different types of connective tissues, and we'll see that in addition to their main function, some of them also have related other functions that are not necessarily related to support. There are a number of differences between connective tissue and epithelial tissue. One of those differences is in the organization of the cells. We saw with epithelial tissue that the cells were spaced very, very, very close together. They are touching, and there wasn't really any space in between the adjacent cells. That's not the case with connective tissue. With connective tissue, the cells are typically far apart from one another, and so there's typically space in between the different connective tissue cells, and there are other substances which fill that space. The term that refers to the stuff in the space between the connective tissue cells is the matrix. So we have the matrix in between the cells, and the matrix in turn also has a couple of components. One of the components of the matrix are the connective tissue fibers, and those connective tissue fibers, as we will see, have different properties and give the overall connective tissue different properties as well. So you have the connective tissue fibers within the matrix. The other portion of the matrix is what we call the ground substance. And the ground substance is the other stuff that fills the space between cells that isn't taken up by the fibers. And the ground substance can vary a great deal in terms of its consistency. It can be a liquid, as in the case with blood. It can be sort of gelatinous or semi-solid, as is in the case with adipose tissue and cartilage, or it can be completely solid, as in the case with bone. So we will see that in addition to those connective tissue fibers, the composition of the ground substance also affects the overall functionality of the tissues. Another difference between epithelial and connective tissues is in the nature of the cells themselves. We saw with epithelial tissues that we had basically the same type of cell comprising the entire tissues, as in the case with something like simple cuboidal epithelium. You had all the same types of cells making up that epithelial layer. With connective tissues, you often have different types of cells. Some of the cells are present continually and in relatively stable numbers in the connective tissue. These are what we call the resident cells. They're always there, and they're pretty much in regular concentrations. You also have cells called wandering cells. Wandering cells, as the name implies, are sometimes there, they're sometimes not. They can invade the tissue, they can be present in different concentrations depending on the internal situations within the body. The two main types of resident cells that we see are cells called fibroblasts and mast cells. Fibroblasts are the cells that actually secrete the fibers that are found in the connective tissues. These are the most common type of resident cell that we see. They're often relatively large, prominent cells, and again, they produce the proteins and secrete those proteins that are going to form the connective tissue fibers. Also found within connective tissues are cells called mast cells. The mast cells are also relatively large, prominent cells, also typically very widely distributed within connective tissues, although they're often located near blood vessels. Mast cells are actually cells which help to initiate inflammatory responses. So these would be allergic type responses in response to foreign substances found within the body. In particular, mast cells release a couple of compounds which facilitate that local inflammatory response. These are heparin and histamine. Heparin is a compound that helps to prevent localized blood clotting, and histamine promotes a number of reactions that are associated with the inflammatory response. Of the wandering cells, we often see cells called macrophages, which are modified types of white blood cells. Macrophages are highly specialized to carry on phagocytosis. And phagocytosis is a very important mechanism for removing invading cells or foreign substances from the body. Those cells are going to engulf foreign materials and, in a lot of cases, break them down and dispose of them. They're typically very numerous, and again, they can increase or decrease their concentration in connective tissues, typically in response to infection and things like that. Sometimes they have different names in different types of connective tissues. For instance, in loose connective tissue, they're often referred to as histocytes. In the liver, they're often referred to as Kupffer cells. In the brain, you have microglial cells that provide this function. So sometimes they can take on different names. So let's look at the different types of connective tissue fibers that are found within connective tissues. Connective tissues are typically going to have one or more of these different types of fibers. The three different types of connective tissue fibers are collagenous fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. And these have different proteins that make them up. In some cases, those proteins and these differences in the proteins give these fibers different physical properties. And the presence of the fibers then gives the overall connective tissue different physical properties. Collagenous fibers are very, very thick threads of the protein collagen. Collagen is probably the major structural protein in the body. It's found all over the place. Again, collagenous fibers are very thick. You have multiple fibrils of these collagenous proteins woven together, and collagenous fibers are very flexible, but not very, only slightly elastic. This combination gives collagenous fibers very high tensile strength. What that means is they are very resistant to pulling forces. You can't stretch them. In fact, if you were to compare equal-sized fibers of steel, collagenous fibers have a higher tensile strength than steel. And again, collagenous fibers are found in a number of different types of connective tissues in many different areas of the body. You see collagenous fibers in bones, you see them in ligaments, in tendons, to a lesser extent underneath the skin, so they're found all over the place. Tissues that have a high concentration of collagenous fibers are often referred to as dense tissues or dense connective tissues. And we'll look at a couple different types of dense connective tissues: dense regular and dense irregular connective tissues. Elastic fibers are composed of a different protein called elastin, and you have very small fibrils that are embedded with this protein elastin. And as you might expect, these elastic fibers are very elastic. They can stretch, but they will rebound. They will return to their original length. And again, as you might expect, elastic fibers are found in areas where a lot of stretch happens. The tissues have to be able to deal with lots of stretching. For instance, in the lungs, as you breathe, the tissue stretches. Your skin stretches as you move. Blood vessel walls increase and decrease in diameter, so you have to have stretch there. So elastic fibers give the matrix a rubbery, resilient quality. Finally, we have reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are also made of the protein collagen, but instead of being very, very, very thick strands of lots of collagen protein. They're very fine collagenous fibers. So what you have is, instead of these thick ropes, you have a very, very fine, often network of small fibers. And reticular fibers are common in specific types of tissue. For instance, lymphatic tissue contains a lot of reticular fibers. But you also see it in other areas. For instance, the basement membranes, or the membranes underlying epithelial tissues, often have a large concentration of reticular fibers. So what you're seeing here is a composite diagram. Not every connective tissue is going to have all of these components, but what this diagram shows you is a number of the different types of cells that you will often find, and a number of the different types of fibers that you will often find in connective tissues, and you can compare their sizes and shapes. For instance, if we look at the fibers, here we have these very large ropes or strands of collagen fibers, and so these are your collagen fibers, and you have your fibrocytes, which are going to secrete the different types of fibers. Here you have a representation of the elastic fibers, which are a little bit thinner. You also have a representation of the reticular fibers, which are even smaller and more delicate. You have, in addition to the fibrocytes, you have a representation of the mast cells, you have a representation of macrophages, in addition to a number of other different cell types. So again, this is a composite diagram. You're not going to see all of these, particularly the blood cells, you're not going to see in connective tissues necessarily. But it gives you an idea of how the different cells compare and how the different fibers compare. And what we'll see is a lot of the fibers, particularly the collagenous fibers, are arranged in particular ways. So now let's look at the individual specific types of connective tissue. We're going to start with one called mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is what we would refer to as embryonic connective tissue. It's only found in the embryo during development, and mesenchyme gives rise to all of the different types of connective tissues. So all of the different types of connective tissues that arise during and after embryonic development ultimately come from this mesenchyme. And it's got a very generic structure. You have the mesenchymal cells, you have generic fibers in there, but it doesn't really have a lot of the more specific characteristics that we'll see in some of the more differentiated connective tissues. So let's look at some of those now. First one is areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is sort of a loosely organized connective tissue. It almost doesn't appear to have much organization at all. You can see in this micrograph the fibers are sort of running in all different directions. You've got a number of the different types of fibers. You have the thick collagenous fibers, which are these sort of thick pink fibers that you're seeing here. The elastic fibers are in here as well. They're sort of running sort of haphazardly in all directions. There are also reticular fibers, although you often can't see them as much. So what we have are collagenous fibers that give the tissue strength. We have elastic fibers that allow it to stretch. And so what we have is a tissue that, in terms of the adult connective tissues, is kind of generic. It's got a certain amount of strength, it's got a certain amount of elasticity. It is often widely distributed under epithelial tissues. It forms the underlying membranes of a lot of your mucous membranes. Those are called lamina propria. It packages different types of organs. It surrounds capillaries. So there's a lot of different areas you find this in the body. It often forms sort of thin, delicate membranes that underlie or overlie different types of organs. Next, we'll look at adipose tissue. Adipose tissue, the main components are the cells. And the cells, called adipocytes, are specialized to contain and store fat. And so what you have are these cells that almost look like bubbles. They're very light and airy. The reason for that is pretty much the entire inside of the cell is taken up by a vacuole that stores fat. And so if you look at the cell, it just looks sort of like a large bag that stores fat. So much so, in fact, that the nuclei of these cells are pushed way off to the side. Some people think they look kind of like rings for this reason. You've got the part that goes around your finger, and if there's a gemstone, it looks kind of like that. So if that helps you in terms of the identification, you can think of it that way. Adipose tissue, again, it's primarily a fat store, so it gives you a reserve of energy, but because of the fact that you have this densely packed amount of fat, it also serves as insulation. Fat helps to conserve heat, and the more fat you have, the more insulative that layer becomes. And so in addition to providing fuel reserves or energy reserves, adipose tissue also helps to insulate the body, and being that it's padding, it also helps to protect organs by just surrounding those organs. Certain organs have a naturally high concentration of adipose tissue. For instance, the breasts have a naturally higher concentration of adipose tissue. You also see certain areas of the body where adipose tends to accumulate naturally, and these can vary depending on whether you're male or female. Reticular tissue, or reticular connective tissue, as the name implies, contains a high concentration of reticular fibers. Reticular connective tissue is very common in a lot of your lymph organs, things like your lymph nodes, your spleen, as well as a few other organs. And you can see in this micrograph, there's these dark reticular fibers that surround the different types of cells, and it forms a network that helps to support the structure of the internal organs. Often you see other cells there like lymphocytes, particularly in those lymphoid organs. Okay, now let's look at the two types of dense connective tissue. As I said, dense connective tissue typically contains densely packed collagenous fibers. And the two types of dense connective tissue represent different arrangements of those connective tissue fibers. We have dense regular connective tissue, in which the connective tissue fibers, the collagenous fibers, are running mostly parallel to one another. So they're all basically running the same direction. We also have dense irregular connective tissue, in which those connective tissue fibers are not as regularly arranged, and they tend to run in all different directions. And as you might expect, this tends to give the tissue slightly different functional properties. Dense connective tissue tends to have a relatively poor vascularization. As a result, it tends to be slow to repair. This is why things like sprains, which are stretching and tearing of tendons and ligaments, tend to take a long time to heal, because they're mostly this dense connective tissue, and it takes a long time for these connective tissues to heal themselves. So here we have dense regular connective tissue, and again, dense regular connective tissue contains large bundles of these collagenous fibers, and they're mostly running the same direction. You can see here in the section it's kind of wavy, but if you look at the individual collagenous fibers, they're all running basically the same direction. And they're so densely packed that the nuclei of those fibroblasts are sort of squished. They look very flattened, and they're squished sort of in between these collagenous fibers. Dense regular connective tissue has a very, very, very high tensile strength. It's very resistant to stretch, and you can pull on it very, very hard. As a result, it tends to be commonly found in things like tendons and ligaments. Tendons allow muscles to pull on bones, and you wouldn't want any elasticity there because it would decrease the strength of the contraction. Also, ligaments hold bones together, and again, you want very strong, solid connections there. Dense irregular connective tissue, you can see, looks very, very, very different. You still have those collagenous fibers, but they're arranged very differently, almost randomly or haphazardly in appearance. You still have the fibroblasts that are in between the fibers, but the different collagenous fibers are running all different directions. What this does is it gives the tissue resistance to pulling in more directions. With the dense regular connective tissue, it's basically resistant to pull in one direction, because the muscle is going to pull on that tendon from one direction only, or the connections between the two bones are going to be in one direction only. Dense irregular connective tissue, however, is resistant to stretch and pulling in more directions. For instance, under the dermis of your skin is one of the places that dense irregular connective tissue is found. Your skin gets pulled in all different directions, and that dense irregular connective tissue helps to compensate for that. Another place you find it is in the fibrous capsules that surround joints. Especially your ball and socket joints move in all different directions, and again, those joint capsules have to be resistant to pulling in more different directions than you would find from a tendon or a ligament. Next, let's talk about cartilage. And again, there's a number of different types of cartilage, but as a group, cartilage has certain characteristics. It tends to be a slightly more rigid, more supportive connective tissue than a lot of the ones we've talked about so far. It does help to provide support and frameworks, and it helps with attachment points, sometimes attaching different areas of the skeleton to one another. Cartilage is also a precursor to different types of bone. You'll learn in the bone development lecture that the different types of bones are formed initially from cartilage. Cartilage, like dense connective tissue, tends to be relatively poorly vascularized, so again, doesn't necessarily heal very quickly. The primary type of cell that you see within cartilages are called chondrocytes. The prefix chond means cartilage. Cytes, of course, means cell. And these chondrocytes are going to be secreting the fibers that are found in the matrix, and they reside in spaces in the matrix called lacunae. You'll hear this term again when we talk about bone. The spaces that the osteocytes are found in are called lacunae. So when you're talking about cartilage or bone, remember that the cells themselves reside in these spaces called lacunae. And then around those lacunae is the matrix containing the connective tissue fibers. Cartilage is often surrounded by other connective tissue. It often has a connective tissue covering called the perichondrium. Again, that's not unlike bone. You'll see that bone has a connective tissue covering called the periosteum. We'll start with hyaline cartilage. Hyaline is the most common type of cartilage. It is found in a number of areas in the body. It's found at the ends of bones, and in that respect, it helps to cushion the bones that make up joints. It also helps to reduce friction. Another part that it's found is in the costal cartilages of the ribs, helping connect the ribs to the sternum. Other places it's found include the soft part of your nose. So if you feel your nose, the front part of your nose, that's hyaline cartilage. It's also found in the respiratory passages as supporting rings, holding the respiratory passages open. So it's found in a lot of places in the body. Hyaline cartilage has a lot of fine collagenous fibers in its matrix, and they're really fine to such an extent that sometimes if you're looking at the cartilage under the microscope, you almost can't even see the fibers. You can sort of see these very thin, wavy lines that are running through the matrix, but they don't look like very thick fibers. So that's one way to differentiate hyaline cartilage visually from some of the other cartilages. Here you can see the lacunae, which are those spaces in the matrix, and then within those spaces, within the lacunae, are the actual chondrocytes themselves. So this is a good example of how those cells are found in those spaces within the matrix. If you look at this type of cartilage in gross section, it almost looks like white plastic, sort of wet, glistening white plastic. This is one of the types of cartilage that is a precursor to bone, long bones. So this type of cartilage is relatively supportive, and it doesn't bend a whole lot, but it flexes a little bit. The next type of cartilage we're going to talk about is elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage differs in that it contains elastic fibers in the matrix. Elastic fibers, as you might expect, give the cartilage a more elastic or flexible composition. One of the places you can find elastic cartilage very readily is in your external ear. So if you were to take and bend your external ear, you can see that it flexes a lot more than, for instance, the front of your nose does. this is a good way to readily see the functional differences between elastic and hyaline cartilage. In addition to providing the framework for the external ears, it is also found in parts of the larynx. And as you might expect, elastic cartilage is found in areas that have to deal with stretching and pulling and shape changing in the different structures, because they're a little more resilient to that than, for instance, hyaline cartilage would be. The last type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. And fibrocartilage contains lots and lots of very, very thick, tough collagenous fibers. And you can see them in this micrograph. There are these thick fibers running more or less parallel to one another, but not quite as highly organized as you might see in dense regular connective tissue. And you can see the chondrocytes within the lacunae are sort of interspersed in between these fibers. The presence of these very thick collagenous fibers makes this type of cartilage very tough and resistant to things like compressive forces and tugging and pulling forces. As a result, you find this type of cartilage in areas that deal with a lot of stress, that are subjected to a lot of pressure. Things like your intervertebral discs are made up of fibrocartilage, and those pad the vertebral bodies so that there's a certain amount of give and resistance to pressure in your vertebral column. Another place that you find fibrocartilage, besides your intervertebral discs, is in the pubic symphysis, that deals with constant pushing and pulling of your pelvic bones on one another. So, often used in sort of a shock absorber kind of a function, fibrocartilage is very tough and very resilient. Next, we have bone, or what we call osseous tissue. And again, when we get to the bone lecture, we'll talk about the difference between bone tissue and bones themselves. But for the moment, let's just talk about bone or osseous tissue. Bone is the most rigid of the connective tissue. The matrix is solid, and that's mostly due to the presence of mineral salts, particularly calcified mineral salts like calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. Those harden, forming a very hard, solid matrix. Bones, as you might expect, provide support. They provide attachment for muscles, allowing you to move around in your environment. They also function as a source or reservoir for these inorganic salts, particularly calcium. If you look at the bones as a whole, you have the marrow, which helps to form blood cells. And bone, unlike a lot of the other connective tissues, is a very active tissue. It's very highly vascularized. As a result, it's very resilient. It remodels itself very readily, and it's very resilient in terms of its ability to repair itself. The main types of bone cells are the osteocytes, which are also in lacunae in the matrix. And again, we'll talk more about this when we do the bone lecture, there are other types of cells that we see in bones. Those other cells help to either lay down more bone matrix or reabsorb more bone matrix. You also tend to see lots of collagen fibers within bones. And finally, we have blood. Blood is technically a connective tissue because you have the cells separated by a matrix. It just so happens that with blood, that matrix is fluid. Now, blood doesn't necessarily provide a supportive function, but it contains cells, and those cells have a number of different functions. Red blood cells function to carry oxygen, white blood cells function in your immune system, and you have the plasma, which makes up the ground substance in the blood, and that plasma also has different functions. It carries proteins, it carries dissolved carbon dioxide, as well as a number of other functions. So blood is technically a connective tissue, although we don't often refer to it as such. Next, we have muscle tissue. And muscle tissue is specialized for contraction. The cells contract. That's what they do. They have protein fibers that are within the cells, and those fibers allow the cell to change shape, allowing them to contract, and when they contract, they exert a pulling force on other tissues, other structures. The easiest way to think about this is your skeletal muscles pulling on bones, and they produce movement. There are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, or sometimes referred to as striated muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac muscle tissue. So let's look at each of those different types of tissue now. Skeletal muscle tissue is the one that we're probably most familiar with. Skeletal muscle tissue is contained in the muscles that we can control with conscious effort, voluntary movement, and is sometimes referred to as voluntary muscle. The cells are long and cylindrical. They look like fibers, and as a result are often referred to as muscle fibers. So you may hear the terms muscle cell and muscle fiber. Those are often used interchangeably. In the case of skeletal muscle, there are stripes. The muscle cells are striped or striated, which is why we often refer to it as striated muscle. These striations are created as a result of the protein filaments overlapping inside the muscle cells. There are places where they overlap, which is what gives you the darker striations, and places where they don't overlap, which is what gives you the lighter areas. And so the organization of these muscle cells, in combination with the overlapping of these protein filaments, gives you this very regular striated appearance. And again, skeletal muscle is attached to structures, and we can control it with conscious effort. A lot of what skeletal muscle does is allow us to interact with and move about in our environment. Smooth muscle tissue is another type of muscle tissue, and smooth muscle, the cells look very much different from skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle cells are not as long as skeletal muscle cells, nor are they striated, which is why we refer to it as smooth muscle. Now, the fact that they're not striated doesn't mean that they don't have the protein filaments. They do. It's just that those filaments are arranged in a different way, and as a result, you don't get that very regular overlapping, and as a result, you don't get those striations. The cells themselves are a different shape as well. Instead of being very long and fibrous like skeletal muscle cells, they are what we call spindle-shaped, which means they're thicker in the middle, which is where the nucleus is, and they taper off to a point at each end. Smooth muscle is contained in the internal organs in your body that you can't control with conscious effort. For instance, the walls of your digestive system are lined with smooth muscle. You can't actively control your stomach to churn or your intestines to move food through your body. So sometimes we refer to this as involuntary muscle. Other places where you find smooth muscle are in the walls of blood vessels. The urinary bladder is another place that you find smooth muscle. Again, creates movement within your body. Often that movement moves substances within your body, but you can't control it with conscious effort. Finally, we have cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle tissue occurs only in the heart, as the name implies, and cardiac muscle has characteristics of striated muscle. For instance, you can see it has striations, not to quite the extent that skeletal muscle does, but it does have striations. But the cells are shaped differently. They're shorter and they're often branched. For instance, you can see here's a branching muscle cell. And another difference is that cardiac muscle cells are connected end to end with one another. Yes, they do branch, which means they form this network, but they're connected end to end. And that's very important, as we'll see, for the functioning of your heart. The stimulus of the heart causing it to contract can flow from one cell to the next. We're not going to get too into that detail right now. We'll get to that when we do cardiovascular system. But the connections, the junctions between adjacent cardiac muscle cells are called intercalated discs. Another difference between cardiac muscle cells and skeletal muscle cells are the fact that skeletal muscle or striated muscle cells often have multiple nuclei. They're so big that a lot of the intracellular mechanisms require the presence of a lot of nuclei up and down the cell. Cardiac muscle cells and smooth muscle cells only have typically a single nucleus. The last of the different types of tissues is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is found in the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, as well as your peripheral nerves. The basic cell involved with nervous tissue are the neurons. Neurons are cells that are specialized to communicate electrochemical impulses. So they have these impulses that travel from one end of the cell to another, and they can actually junction with other neurons. As a result, they form a network of communication, allowing for coordination and control of some of the other more specialized body cells. So this is the basic cell of the nervous system, of nervous tissue. It's the neurons. There are other cells associated with the nervous system, however. You have cells called neuroglial cells that support neurons. They help to connect them to blood vessels. They help to regulate their external environment. So neurons are the cells that are actually conducting the impulses, but you have other cells as well which help to facilitate functioning of nervous tissue. And again, nervous tissue is all about coordination and control of the different organs within your body.